July 25th, 1995. Lincoln, Nebraska. 18-year-old university student Tina McMenamin fails to show up for her shift at work, and her body is found inside her apartment bedroom later that night. Tina has been sexually assaulted and stabbed 7 times, and the apartment is ransacked. Nearly 1 year later, DNA testing links a suspect named Gregory Gable to a strand of hair found in Tina's hand, and he is subsequently charged with her murder. However, before Gable can go to trial, a second round of DNA testing excludes him from being the source of the hair, so the charges against him are dismissed, and Tina's murder is never solved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a cold case from Nebraska, the 1995 murder of Tina McMenamin. This story involves the brutal death of a university student and was originally suggested to me over a year ago by a listener named Samantha. Back when I did my Q&A episode at the end of 2020, I was asked a question about whether there were any states where I had not yet covered a case on The Trail Went Cold, and since Nebraska was one of them, I thought now would be an ideal time to do this episode. Now, this is one of the more unusual murder cases I've ever done, because it features a suspect being simultaneously implicated and cleared by DNA testing. When Tina McMenamin's body was found, she had a strand of hair clutched in her hand which likely belonged to her killer, and the hair's DNA would eventually be matched to a man named Gregory Gable. This might seem like an open and shut case, but DNA testing in the 1990s was nowhere near as sophisticated as it is today. When a second round of DNA testing was performed on the hair, it actually excluded Gable, so the authorities no longer believed they could bring him to trial for Tina's murder and dismiss the charges against him. In spite of this, investigators have never completely eliminated Gable as a suspect, and the conflicting results from the separate DNA tests have opened up questions about their validity. Regardless of Gable's guilt or innocence, the investigation has remained at a standstill for the past 2 decades, and Tina McMenamin's murder is officially unsolved, so we're going to explore all sides of this controversial case on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved murder of Tina McMenamin. Our story begins in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1995, and our central figure is 18-year-old Martina McMenamin, who goes by the name Tina. Tina was originally born in Japan because her father was stationed there in the military at that time, but her parents soon moved back to the United States. They divorced when Tina was only 3 years old, and after her father moved to Texas, she would be raised as an only child in Omaha by her single mother. After graduating high school, Tina moved away to attend University of Nebraska-Lincoln, aka UNL, and has just completed her freshman year. She had spent the year living in one of the dormitories, but found the experience too noisy, so in May, she decided to move into the Amberwood Apartments complex alongside her friend and fellow UNL student, Sarah Bognich. Tina is currently working a summer job at a local Godfather's Pizza establishment, which is only a 5-minute drive from her apartment. On Tuesday, July the 25th, Tina was scheduled to work a split shift, which meant she would show up to handle the lunch rush, go home for a few hours, and then return during the evening for the dinner rush at 5:30 p.m. After completing the first part of her shift that day, Tina left Godfather's Pizza at 2 o'clock to go back to her apartment, and she would last be seen by her roommate Sarah when she left to go to work at her own job at 4:45. Sarah returned home shortly before 10:20 p.m., but when she entered the apartment, she was shocked to discover that it had been ransacked. Sarah noticed there was a message on the answering machine, and when she listened to it, she became concerned when she heard the voice of Tina's manager at Godfather's Pizza, who was calling to check why Tina had not shown up for her shift at 5:30. Upon hearing this, Sarah immediately began searching the apartment for Tina and soon discovered her body in a pool of blood on the floor inside Tina's bedroom. Sarah immediately contacted the Lincoln Police Department, who arrived at the scene. It turned out that Tina had been stabbed 7 times, and her official cause of death was blood loss from multiple sharp force injuries. She had also been sexually assaulted and had a number of cuts on her body. 4 artificial fingernails had broken off Tina's hands, which seemed to indicate that she put up a struggle against her attacker, and a long strand of blonde hair was found clutched in her hand. There were no signs of forced entry, and even though the apartment was ransacked, nothing appeared to have been stolen, so the crime did not seem to be a burglary. 2 knives were found in the apartment and taken into evidence by police, one of which was a wooden-handled knife lying next to Tina's body. However, I'm not sure if it was ever determined if this knife belonged to Tina or if the killer brought it with them. There was also a noticeable smell of chlorine bleach inside the apartment bathroom, which suggested that the killer had used it to destroy evidence and clean himself up, though no trace of bleach was found in Tina's bedroom. 2 of Tina's neighbors from the apartment complex told police that they had been at their place until 5:15 p.m. and had not heard any noise before they left, but the evidence seemed to show that the murder occurred a very short time later. The last person to speak with Tina was a woman named Lou Friend, who had previously hired both Tina and Sarah to babysit her children. They spoke on the phone that afternoon, and Lou said she invited both women to her house later that night after they got off work. Lou confirmed that nothing sounded out of the ordinary during their conversation, and phone records would show that the call ended at 5:17 p.m. A handwritten note to Sarah about Lou's invitation was actually found on the apartment's refrigerator, which had presumably been written by Tina following the phone call. And since Tina was scheduled to return to work for her shift at 5:30, this meant she was attacked before she had a chance to leave. Another resident of the apartment complex would report having seen a young white male running away from the complex's common area sometime around 9 p.m., and a second eyewitness reported seeing this man about a half-mile away. He was described as being between 18 and 22 years old, somewhere around 5'10" and 150 to 170 pounds, dressed in white or gray loose-fitting shorts and a red or pink button-down shirt. He also had long, dirty blonde hair, which was tied in a ponytail, and he may have had a gold hoop earring in his left ear. A composite sketch would be circulated of this blonde man, and if he was the killer, then the timeline indicated that he had remained in Tina's apartment for hours after murdering her, and likely spent the time ransacking the place and cleaning himself up. Since Tina did not have a boyfriend and was not believed to be dating anyone at the time of her death, no one stood out as an obvious suspect. The crime proved so traumatic for Sarah Bognich that she decided to drop out of university. A strange development would occur on September the 27th when an anonymous handwritten letter postmarked from Omaha was mailed to the University of Nebraska Foundation and subsequently turned over to the police. It simply read, quote, "Patrick Holmes killed Tina McMenamin." In spite of an extensive investigation, police were unable to turn up anyone named Patrick Holmes who lived in the area or had any tangible connection to this crime. Another interesting development took place in December of that year when a 21-year-old man named Daniel Stroll was arrested in the town of York for the murder of 51-year-old Pamela Kelly, whom Stroll had beaten and sexually assaulted in a local park before running her over with his car. Stroll was a former resident of the Amberwood Apartments complex and had abruptly moved out and left Lincoln a short time after Tina's murder. While this seemed to make Stroll a promising suspect, a time card showed that he was at work on the day Tina was killed, and no evidence linked him to the crime. The Lincoln Police Department's investigation lasted for nearly a year, as they interviewed hundreds of people and collected blood samples from between 30 and 40 men whom they considered to be potential persons of interest. The strand of blonde hair found in Tina's hand was sent to a Maryland-based forensic laboratory called Cellmark Diagnostics, who performed DNA testing on the hair's follicle. Those results, along with the aforementioned blood samples, were subsequently sent to a DNA laboratory at the University of Nebraska Medical Center for comparison. In June of 1996, it was announced that a match had been made, and that the DNA from the hair was consistent with a 32-year-old Lincoln resident named Gregory Gable. According to the results, Gable was one out of 1,049 white males in the United States who matched the DNA, and on the basis of this new evidence, he would be arrested on the charges of first-degree murder and use of a weapon to commit a felony. Gable had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent the past 16 years of his life as a resident of Our Homes Assisted Living, an organization which provided housing for adults with developmental disabilities and mental illness. Gable was described as having a childlike demeanor and was known in the area for displaying creepy and socially inappropriate behavior in public, particularly towards women. In fact, in 1991, Gable had been arrested on 4 counts of third-degree sexual assault and 3 counts of public indecency after he was accused by multiple women of grabbing their breasts and buttocks and exposing himself. While some of these charges were later dropped, Gable was ultimately convicted on 2 counts of third-degree sexual assault and 1 count of public indecency, for which he received a sentence of 9 months probation. Police had decided to collect a blood sample from Gable not only due to his past convictions, but because he could be placed in the area on the night of Tina's murder. At approximately 10 p.m., shortly before Tina's body was discovered, Gable showed up at a Sonic Drive-In restaurant located 1 block away from the Amberwood Apartments complex. However, while some members of the community had no trouble believing that Gable committed the crime, other people who knew him personally did not think he was capable of murder. In fact, following his arrest, a number of residents contacted the American Civil Liberties Union because they feared the police might coerce Gable into making a false confession to the crime. Gable was known for being a regular patron at the Sonic Drive-In, who would sometimes do cleaning for them in exchange for free food. In fact, he always showed up there on Tuesday nights because they had a half-price burger promotion, and since the crime took place on a Tuesday, his presence there that night was not out of character at all. There was also some question about how much Gable resembled the blonde man seen running away from the apartment complex. While Gable did wear his hair in a ponytail, it was more of a light brown color rather than dirty blonde. In addition, Gable always wore large, round-frame glasses, yet neither of the eyewitnesses reported seeing glasses on the blonde man. Gable was held in the Lancaster County Jail and maintained his innocence, and after being appointed a public defender, he officially entered a plea of not guilty. Throughout the summer of 1997, a number of pretrial hearings would be held in Lancaster County District Court, and additional evidence against him would be presented. This included the eyewitness testimony of a librarian named Carolyn Dow, who claimed that sometime in May of 1996, she overheard an incriminating conversation in the Bennett Martin Public Library between Gable and a friend of his named Jeremy Nelson. She said she heard Gable describe the strangling and stabbing of a woman in graphic detail before he said, quote, "Imagine what it feels like to kill someone." Dow also thought she heard Gable say the name Tina. When Jeremy Nelson was called upon to testify, he denied this conversation with Gable ever took place, but it was pointed out that Nelson had a documented history of issues with memory and recall and may have simply forgotten the incident. A lot of emphasis was also placed on the fact that Tina's killer had used bleach to clean himself before he left the murder scene. Gable was known for doing janitorial work at various nightclubs throughout Lincoln, and 3 employees would testify that they had heard Gable talk extensively about the benefits of bleach and what a great sanitizer it was. In fact, about a month before Tina's murder, there was an incident at one of the nightclubs where Gable used bleach to clean up a pool of blood after a fight took place. By the end of the year, the Lancaster County District Judge ordered that Gable undergo a competency evaluation at the Lincoln Regional Center, and a psychiatrist would rule that Gable was not mentally competent to stand trial. The Lancaster County District Attorney contested this ruling, but it wasn't long before an unexpected development took place. Due to the controversy surrounding the DNA evidence, a mutual decision was made by the prosecution and the defense to have a second round of DNA testing performed on the strand of hair found in Tina's hand. Since the first DNA test had used up the follicle on the hair, the second test would be performed on the hair shaft, and some newly developed mitochondrial DNA analysis would be done at Penn State University. Well, to everyone's shock, the new testing excluded Gable as being the source of the hair. As a result, the state's case against Gable was seriously damaged, so rather than take him to trial, they decided to dismiss the charges against him, and he would be released from the Lancaster County Jail on July 16, 1998. However, the Lincoln Police Department stated that they still considered Gable to be the prime suspect and would charge him with the crime again if new evidence ever surfaced. They suspected that something had gone wrong with the second round of DNA testing, and even began expressing doubts that the blonde hair even belonged to the killer. Unfortunately, since the testing had used up all the genetic material on the hair, no further DNA analysis could be performed. The police re-examined and analyzed virtually every piece of evidence which was collected from Tina's apartment to see if they could find any genetic material which belonged to the killer, but whenever it was sent to a lab for testing, it turned out there was just not enough usable DNA to yield any results. Gable was kept under surveillance for years following his release, and one of the investigators, Rich Doetker, went to the trouble of attempting an undercover operation. Doetker rented an apartment located near Gable's residence and posed as a tanning salon manager in order to befriend Gable and engage in such social activities as taking him to strip clubs. Doetker hoped that Gable might let loose some incriminating statements about Tina McMenamin's murder, but he never said anything about the crime. In 2005, an inmate came forward and told police that years earlier, he had spent time in jail with a man who mentioned Tina's case. This person allegedly told the inmate that he took some personal items from Tina's apartment and hid them behind some rocks on a bike trail located just down the road from the Amberwood Apartments complex. His reasoning for doing so was because he wanted to go back and re-fantasize about the murder. He also supposedly told the inmate that he was planning to kidnap and kill at least 2 other women and asked if he wanted to help. While the name of this man has never been released publicly, police did confirm that he was a suspect in Tina's case and that they had made contact with him. They also asked anyone from the public to come forward if they remembered ever finding a photograph or piece of jewelry along that bike trail, though they never actually specified if those particular items were stolen from Tina's apartment. Unfortunately, this particular lead never went anywhere, and there haven't been any major developments in this case in quite some time, so after more than 25 years, Tina McMenamin's murder officially remains unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I'd like to take a few moments to play a promo for another true crime podcast called The Murder Sheet. Have a listen.
Are you a true crime fan who prefers hearing about obscure but fascinating mysteries?
Then you should be listening to The Murder Sheet. I'm Kevin Greenley, and I'm a lawyer representing the sister of a murder victim.
And I'm Anya Kane, a journalist with an interest in stories about unsolved cases. We connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides.
We'll share stories of healing in the wake of tragedy, infuriating instances of possible wrongful convictions, and disturbing cold cases. We'll talk to FBI officials, dogged defense lawyers, and veteran police investigators to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes. We won't just be recapping the headlines on each case. We'll be digging deep into these murders ourselves to bring you the real story. Subscribe to The Murder Sheet wherever you listen to podcasts.
So while DNA evidence is generally regarded as a slam dunk when it comes to solving cases today, this particular story is a reminder of how much the process of DNA profiling has evolved over the past few decades. Even though DNA evidence had already been used in criminal cases for a couple of years up until this point, the whole concept really entered the mainstream when it was introduced during the O.J. Simpson trial, which, appropriately enough, took place in 1995 and was still ongoing at the time Tina McMenamin was murdered. In fact, I found a few articles about Tina's case from that time period, which mentioned the DNA evidence in the O.J. trial, though they kind of highlighted some of the issues with the evidence here. As you recall, DNA testing was performed on a strand of hair found clutched in Tina's hand, and the process they used was called DQ alpha testing, which compares DNA found in the nucleus of cells. When the results were compared with the DNA from blood samples that had been collected from a number of persons of interest in this case, Gregory Gable was the only match. But the problem is that the results also showed that 1 out of every 1,049 white males could have been a match to the hair. Let's just say that there were around 100 million white males living in the United States in 1995. With those odds, that means there would have been over 95,000 other men who matched the DNA on that hair, so those results are hardly conclusive proof that Gable was guilty. To make a comparison to the O.J. Simpson case, when DNA testing was performed on a drop of blood found at the murder scene, it had genetic markers which showed that there was a 1 in 170 million chance that the blood belonged to anyone else but O.J., though, as I'm sure you know, that still wasn't enough to get him convicted. But to make another comparison, there's the conviction of Stuart Heaton for the murder of Crystal Knabb, which was once featured as a final appeal segment on Unsolved Mysteries. Heaton's trial took place in 1992, and the primary evidence against him was a semen sample from the victim's body, as DNA profiling matched it to Heaton, which showed that 1 out of every 52,600 white males could have been the donor. But there was question about the validity of the DNA evidence, as even if the results were accurate, this meant there were at least 4,800 people in the United States, other than Heaton, who could have had the same DNA profile. Well, years later, a new round of more advanced DNA testing was performed, and this time, the results showed there was a 1 in 31 billion chance that anyone else but Heaton was the source of that semen sample, which pretty much closed the books on that case. Generally, when DNA profiling is used to charge someone with a crime today, the odds of them being a match are generally in the millions, if not billions, which is why the 1 in 1,049 odds used to charge Gregory Gable are not that impressive, and it may have just been coincidental bad luck that the DNA happened to match him. Since DNA testing was not as advanced during the 1990s, it actually wasn't all that uncommon for multiple tests to be performed on evidence in murder cases in order to confirm the reliability of the results, though things obviously did not go as planned here. The second round of DNA testing that Gable received was mitochondrial DNA analysis, which excluded him as being the source of the hair and was considered to be much more reliable than the original DQ alpha testing. Of course, I'm sure that if more sophisticated DNA testing was performed on the evidence today, it would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt whether or not Gable is guilty, but the problem is that the previous tests completely destroyed the strand of hair, and according to police, there is literally no other available evidence with enough genetic material to be tested. So at this point, it seems like it would probably take a confession or someone coming forward with incriminating information to solve this crime. And even though the second round of DNA testing excluded Gable, the Lincoln Police Department have not eliminated him as a suspect, and judging by some of their comments, they are still convinced they got the right guy all along. However, I think the biggest complication with this case is Gregory Gable himself, as he's done enough creepy and unsettling things in his life to make one believe he could have been responsible for this crime, but on the other hand, you could interpret this as the story of an innocent man who was railroaded for a crime he did not commit because of his mental illness. I know that Gable was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and while I'm not sure if he was ever officially diagnosed with autism, it sounds like local residents often compared him to Dustin Hoffman's autistic savant character in the Academy Award-winning film Rain Man, because Gable had an exceptional ability to memorize numbers and facts and endlessly talk about them. During my research on this case, I discovered a subreddit for Lincoln, Nebraska, which had a couple of threads about Gable, and there's even a post about this case at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, where commenters have shared some personal anecdotes about him. Long story short, it sounds like Gable was already a well-known character in Lincoln, even before he was charged with murder. When Gable was arrested, some of the newspaper articles referred to him as an exotic dancer, which I found pretty odd, but it turned out that when one of the local nightclubs held amateur strip nights, Gable was always one of the first people to go up on stage and strip without hesitation, and even though he wasn't particularly good at it, to say the least, it would usually help break the ice and encourage other people to participate. He earned the nickname Night Rider and was often seen riding around Lincoln on his bicycle, usually without a shirt on. However, the thing Gable was most known for around the area was his creepy and inappropriate behavior towards women and his tendency to follow them around. In fact, those aforementioned Reddit threads contained a number of stories from commenters who claim they witnessed it firsthand, and it sounds like it's pretty much common knowledge in the area for women to steer clear of him. Prior to the murder, Gable was arrested for third-degree sexual assault and public indecency for multiple incidents where he groped and exposed himself to females, and in November of 2009, he actually made the news again when he was arrested for harassing a female employee at a tanning salon. Gable reportedly looked at her chest and stated, quote, "It should be okay for women to walk around with their shirts off because it's okay for men, too." He then looked at her name tag and made a comment about how he liked the Quentin Tarantino-directed movie Death Proof because it featured a psychopath who liked to stalk and kill young women, and the employee just happened to share the name as one of the female characters from the movie. Before he left, Gable told the woman that he would be returning there every day at the same time to see her, which concerned her enough to phone the police. While Gable only wound up being issued a citation for disturbing the peace, he was banned from the tanning salon. So yes, when you hear stories like this, you can understand why many people had no trouble believing that he was responsible for killing Tina McMenamin. But on the other hand, if you look at the media coverage from that time period, there were others, such as the woman who ran Our Home's assisted living and provided Gable with his housing, who firmly believed he was innocent. While they did not deny that he had a history of troubling behavior, they never saw him get violent and had a hard time believing he was capable of murder. Indeed, while there's no defending any of Gable's actions towards women, you do have to wonder if it's because he simply has no concept or understanding of appropriate social norms. It sounds like most of the documented incidents where Gable crossed the line involved him approaching females in public places, and while he was known for creepily following and stalking them, I haven't heard any stories about him forcing his way into anyone's home, which is what Tina's killer did. I would be curious to know if Gable ever frequented Godfather's Pizza, because if he went there while Tina was working, I could definitely see him developing a fixation on her, but I haven't heard anything to indicate that they ever crossed paths. But theoretically, let's just say that Gable decided to follow Tina home after she completed her lunch shift on the day of the murder. Tina was not actually killed until approximately 3.5 hours after she arrived at her apartment, so would Gable have really hung around there that long, waiting for her to leave? I have no trouble whatsoever with the Lincoln Police Department looking at Gable as a potential suspect, but I think the biggest flaw with the investigation is that they relied too much on the results of the original DNA testing and did not ensure there was stronger corroborating evidence against him. Regardless of Gable's guilt or innocence, I'm very troubled by the undercover operation from that one investigator, Rich Doker, who befriended Gable after he was released from jail and tried to get him to spill incriminating information about the murder. Even if Gable had confessed and wound up getting arrested again, I'm sure the validity of the confession would have been called into question because Gable's mental illness made him very susceptible. In fact, given that Gable seemed to have no filter when it came to interacting with or talking about women, it is surprising that he wouldn't have said anything about the murder if he was guilty. So let's go back and explore the circumstances of how Tina's murder was carried out. We know that she was last heard from in a phone call to Lou Friend, which ended at 5:17 p.m., and she was able to write out a note about this call to her roommate, Sarah Vognich. Since Tina had to leave her apartment and return to Godfather's Pizza for her shift at 5:30, and the drive there took approximately 5 minutes, something had to happen to Tina during a very narrow window of around 8 minutes after the phone call ended. We also know that Sarah left the apartment at 4:45, so theoretically, if someone was stalking or watching over Tina, they would have known she was alone. There were reportedly no signs of forced entry, so you have to wonder if Tina was in the midst of walking out the door before the killer interrupted her and forced her back inside the apartment. Or it's possible that someone went there and knocked on the door and attacked Tina after she opened it. Certain details about the crime are a bit vague in the reporting, likely because the police wanted to withhold information from the public, but I get the impression that Tina put up quite a fight against her attacker before she was stabbed 7 times. Sources say that 2 knives were taken from the apartment as evidence, one of which was found next to Tina's body, but it's unclear if the murder weapon was a knife Tina already owned or if the killer brought it with them. It's possible Tina may have grabbed it to defend herself before the killer took it away and stabbed her. And while it's been reported that Tina was sexually assaulted, I can only assume the perpetrator did not leave any semen samples behind, because otherwise, I'm sure they would have been tested for DNA. But the most bizarre detail I cannot get a handle on is how the entire apartment was ransacked. According to Sarah, it appeared that the perpetrator looked through virtually everything they owned, but it sounds like nothing was actually stolen and that robbery did not appear to be the motive for this crime. And of course that only opens up the question, what was the motive for this crime? If the killer was deliberately targeting Tina, why did he spend so much time ransacking the place? She had only been living there 2 months, so what exactly was he expecting to find? This almost makes me wonder if this crime was a case of mistaken identity and Tina was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps the killer had an issue with the apartment's previous tenant and mistakenly assumed they were still living there, though I'm hoping investigators already explored this angle. We have a sighting of a blonde man running through the area at around 9 p.m., which is over 3 hours after the murder is believed to have taken place, but if this man was the killer, it actually makes sense that he would have stayed in the apartment that long. Not only did he completely ransack the place, but he apparently spent a lot of time using bleach to clean himself up and get rid of forensic evidence. It sounds like he did a pretty thorough job, because other than the hair found clutched in Tina's hand, police have never been able to turn up any DNA or genetic material which could link them to a suspect, and bleach is very effective when it comes to destroying DNA. But you really have to wonder if Gregory Gable would have had the mental capacity to do something like this. I know that during the pretrial hearings, the state introduced some witnesses who testified that Gable had a lot of experience using bleach and frequently talked about how effective it was, But would he really have had the wherewithal to do such an effective job at eradicating all the evidence from a murder scene? I mean, I know Gable was considered to be a savant who had an extraordinary memory, but I'm not sure if that skill translates to covering up a murder. This was also the pre-CSI era of the mid-1990s, when the general public did not have as much knowledge of forensics. How many people would have even known about DNA evidence and been aware that bleach could completely destroy it? You get the impression that the person who cleaned up this crime scene really knew what they were doing. Another issue was that Gable really did not have much of a resemblance to the composite sketch of the blonde man seen running through the area that night, and even though it was widely circulated throughout the area, I don't believe anyone ever came forward and said, "That looks just like Gregory Gable." Now, to be fair, I've seen the sketch, and it's not particularly well drawn, and it's so nondescript that I'm not sure it could ever be used to positively identify a suspect. The man was described as having a ponytail, which Gable often wore, but there's been some debate about whether the hair color matches. Gable's hair was described as being light brown, as opposed to dirty blonde, which is a particularly important detail since the hair found clutched in Tina's hand was described as being blonde. However, I think the biggest discrepancy is that neither of the witnesses who saw the blonde man described him as wearing glasses, whereas Gable wore a distinct pair of glasses, which he apparently always had on in public because he was practically blind without them. So I can't see Gable committing this murder without his glasses. On the other hand, it's never been conclusively established that this blonde man was the killer, so all this discussion about his resemblance to Gable might be meaningless. Now, at the outset of the investigation, police collected blood samples from between 30 to 40 people whom they believed to be potential suspects, but it doesn't sound like they had any particular reason to focus on Gable until the DNA testing matched him. I think the main reason Gable popped up on the radar to begin with was not only due to his past history of troubling behavior with women, but because he could be placed in the Sonic Drive-In restaurant located a block away from Tina's apartment, as he showed up there shortly before her body was discovered. But Gable was known for being a regular customer, and interestingly enough, one of the reasons he was so well known by the staff was because he had a tendency to show up without a shirt on, which was against the rules. It sounds like it was Gable's ordinary routine to frequent the place on Tuesday nights because of their half-price burger promotion, so there really doesn't seem to be anything unusual about him being there on the night Tina was killed. If anything, given how savants are known for rigidly sticking to routines, it probably would have looked more suspicious if Gable didn't show up there that night. From what I can tell, the employees didn't notice anything out of the ordinary about Gable, and given that the odor of bleach supposedly permeated the bathroom in Tina's apartment, you'd think they would have smelled bleach on Gable if he had used it to clean himself up. It's also worth noting that 4 of Tina's artificial fingernails had fallen off, likely because she put up a struggle against her attacker. This meant she may have left scratches on him, but I don't see any indication that there were reports of scratches on Gable at the Sonic Drive-In that night. If Gable committed this crime, and was the blonde man seen running away from the apartment complex at 9 p.m., that means he would have made the decision to practically return to the scene of the crime 1 hour later in order to grab a burger, which seems like an unusual thing to do. But the thing with Gable is that he's such an enigma. In most murder cases, you can make assumptions about a suspect's guilt or innocence based on their actions, but since Gable does not function like a typical human being, and has always been known for doing things which go against traditional social norms, you can interpret his actions in so many different ways. So let's talk about some of the other so-called evidence against Gable besides the DNA. I've already addressed his so-called obsession with bleach, but there's also the testimony of the librarian, Carolyn Dow, who claimed she overheard Gable having a conversation with one of his friends about killing a woman. Well, I'm not sure I'd put much stock into this, because it sounds like Dow kept changing her story. The first few times she spoke with police, she apparently never mentioned the specific detail about hearing Gable say the name Tina until she decided to bring it up at the pretrial hearing. I'm not saying this conversation never took place, as speaking loudly about inappropriate subjects in a public library does sound like the type of thing Gable would do, but I don't think it's particularly compelling evidence that he's guilty of murder. For all we know, he could have read about Tina's murder in the newspaper and just felt like talking about it with his friend. While this didn't take place until years after the charges against Gable were dismissed, we also have to mention the jailhouse informant who came forward and told police that a suspect once told him that he killed Tina, stole some of her personal items, and hid them next to a bike trail. Police never specified if anything was stolen from Tina's apartment, but since they sent out a public plea for anyone to come forward if they remembered finding unusual items next to that bike trail, this might indicate that a few items were taken. While it's never been publicly confirmed who this suspect is, it is easy to infer that it was Gregory Gable, as he apparently liked to ride along that particular bike trail a lot. In fact, some of the incidents he got arrested for, which involved groping and exposing himself to women, reportedly took place on bike trails. But even if this man was referring to Gable, I'm sure you're all aware that you have to take stories from jailhouse informants with a huge grain of salt, as they're notorious for often sharing false information with the police in order to benefit themselves. It's unclear when exactly this confession was supposed to have taken place, but we know that Gable was incarcerated in the Lancaster County Jail from 1996 until 1998 while awaiting trial for Tina's murder. This inmate did not come forward until 2005, so why wait that long if this story was true? And once again, even if Gable really did say these things, it wouldn't have been out of character for him to say creepy things about women for no apparent reason. So if Gable didn't commit this crime, then who could the real killer have been? Well, it is pretty unsettling that we have another suspect, Daniel Stroll, who moved out of Tina's apartment complex and left the area a very short time after she was killed, and then went on to brutally murder another woman less than 5 months later. Stroll is currently serving a life sentence for the murder of Pamela Kelly and is not eligible for parole until 2027. I know investigators started leaning away from Stroll as a suspect because a time card showed that he was at work on the day Tina was killed, but one news article I read stated that even though Stroll was not a primary suspect, he had not been completely eliminated as a suspect either. I hope the police did their due diligence and triple-checked to make sure Stroll couldn't have committed this crime, but it's unclear if they ever took the step of collecting his DNA and checking it against the evidence. The idea of Tina being stalked by a fellow tenant who decided to attack her when he saw her leaving her apartment would definitely make sense, but no evidence has ever surfaced to suggest that Stroll did this. As far as other potential suspects, there's the mysterious Patrick Holmes, who was named as the killer in an anonymous letter, but the problem is that we can't even be certain that he exists. That letter is pretty bizarre, as it was sent to the University of Nebraska Foundation instead of the police, and contained no specific details other than Patrick Holmes killed Tina McMenamin. I mean, investigators never found anyone in the Lincoln area named Patrick Holmes, but if the letter was nothing more than a cruel prank, then it's odd that the writer would implicate an individual with no known connection to the case, unless this was an act of intentional misdirection from the real killer who was trying to mislead the investigation towards a non-existent person. If the letter is legitimate, maybe there was a person named Patrick Holmes who was just passing through the area and left town immediately after killing Tina, but no one has been able to figure out who he is and track him down. The reason this crime is so perplexing is that Tina did not have any known enemies, and no one has ever been able to think of any potential suspects who would have had a motive to murder her in such a brutal fashion. I guess the whole crime could just be a simple case of some random predator seeing Tina heading out her apartment door and then taking advantage of the situation. As far as Gregory Gable, I know the Lincoln Police Department have tried to say that something was flawed with the second round of DNA testing, which is why the hair didn't match him, and they've even gone so far as to imply that maybe the hair did not actually belong to the killer. Well, if there was some other damning evidence which implicated Gable, I might be more receptive to these ideas, but without the original DNA results, the case against him is virtually non-existent. Gable's history of behavior towards women is very troubling, but it still does not prove that he committed the murder, so the state definitely made the right decision not to bring him to trial with the evidence they had, and I fear the authorities might still have serious tunnel vision against him. But even if Gable is guilty, the issue with convicting him or any other suspect of the crime is that there's virtually no forensic evidence to work with. That means the only thing which might lead to this case being solved is for the right person to come forward with the right information. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Tina McMenamin, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I released an episode about the notorious zip gun bomber, an unidentified individual who sent booby-trap packages to a number of different people that were rigged with a homemade zip gun device, which fired off bullets when the packages were opened. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Gia, Sarah S., and Lori E. Thank you all so much for your support. And I'd also like to mention that this coming Saturday, February the 6th, from 8 p.m. until 11:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we are going to be holding another Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathon in which we screen classic segments from Unsolved Mysteries, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. You can find a link to our screening room pinned to the top of our Facebook and Twitter pages, and we'll also include a link to it in our show notes. So once again, our live watch is this coming Saturday, February the 6th, and starts at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'd also like to announce that later this year, provided that it becomes safe to travel again, The Trail Went Cold is going to be appearing on Podcast Row at 2 separate CrimeCon events. The regular CrimeCon, which takes place at the Fairmont Hotel in Austin, Texas, from June 4th until the 6th, and the very first CrimeCon UK, which is being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London the following weekend on June the 12th and 13th. If you would like to purchase tickets to either event, we have a special promo code you can use to get a 10% discount, and it applies to both the Austin and London events. So to receive 10% off, either visit crimecon.com or crimecon.co.uk and enter the promo code COLD21. That's COLD21. In addition, I also wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes of every episode, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.